afternoon, Hartford, and welcome again to another session of Voices of Veterans presented to you by myself, Dave Yano, a combat veteran of Vietnam, and Steve Fournier, an Air Force veteran who served in Europe in the counterintelligence during the Vietnam War, even though the troops in Germany were not involved as heavily as we were in Southeast Asia. They were also there to contain Soviet forces at that time as part of our containment strategy and the Cold War. Vietnam was a segment of the hot war that was being waged during the Cold War that we've been waging ever since the end of the Second World War. In fact, I would say that the United States has been in a state of constant warfare since the end of the Second World War, which was the last legally, constitutionally declared war that the United States was involved in. So today we're going to talk a little bit about our so-called longest war, which is what the media has been calling the war in Afghanistan. But before I do that, I want to have a public service announcement. For the 4th Annual Connecticut Peace Conference, Retooling the War Economy in Connecticut, How We Can Build Good Green Jobs and Infrastructure for Human Needs, with Code Pink co-founder Media Benjamin appearing there. It's going to be held at Middlesex Community College at Chapman Hall, Saturday, November 9th, 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. It's free and open to all, and lunch will be provided. For information, RSVP, contact SK Ravisky at mxcc.edu. That's at Manchester Community College, and it's put on by the Connecticut Peace and Solidarity Coalition, along with members of Veterans for Peace, Chapter 42 of Central Connecticut. So that's something to look forward to, and I am going to be serving on a panel along with another Iraq veteran, and there'll be several panels and discussions going on with the audience that shows up. But as I mentioned before, the war in Afghanistan has been touted as America's longest war, and that's really not true. The war in Vietnam lasted 30 years, from 1945 until 1975, but you could say the war on drugs was one of the longest continuous wars that we've been engaged in. But in actuality, the war against the indigenous population of the United States of America has been waged ever since the first of us landed on this land, and it's over 500 years ago. So being in a state of war is something that Americans are used to, and I think that it has incredibly heightened our history of violence that we have been engaged in, that we've been affected by all these years, and I think it has a lot to do with what Americans do with the weapons that they have in their own hands. But today, I'm going to talk about Pat Tillman. Pat Tillman was an athlete and a professional football player, grew up in California, the oldest of 3 boys. And after 9/11, he was motivated to do what he felt was his duty, which was to enlist in the United States military and volunteer to fight in the wars that were ongoing at the time. And he did serve a tour in Iraq in 2003. In fact, he was part of the Jessica Lynch when they saved her lifted her out of the hospital where she was being kept as a captive, so to speak. And he felt in his own terms that the war in Iraq was wrong. He said it was an illegal, unconstitutional war. This from Pat Tillman. His brother also enlisted with him, so Kevin and Pat Tillman were both Army Rangers. This book was written by John Krakauer called Where Men Win Glory, and I'm going to read a little bit from it to talk a little bit about what happened to Pat Tillman, because he was killed in Afghanistan on April 22nd in 2004, a victim of friendly fire, or what's also known as fratricide. Not long after Pat was killed, a remote Army fire base 7 miles south of the hillside where he perished was named in his honor. Forward Operating Base Tillman. In the winter of 2007, a small contingent of American soldiers was stationed here, along with a company of Afghan National Army recruits and a handful of fighters from the Afghan Security Guard. The latter, known as the ASG, is a paramilitary militia under contract to the U.S. Army to provide additional security around the base and to accompany American patrols on missions into the surrounding countryside, which is still controlled by the Taliban, who belong to the Haqqani network. Forward Operating Base Tillman, squatting less than 2 miles from the Pakistani border, encircled by a 7-foot-thick blast wall constructed from earthen HESCO barriers topped with razor wire, is attacked frequently by Haqqani forces. Recruited and trained by American Special Forces, members of the ASG are courageous, highly skilled fighters who have earned the esteem of their American counterparts. Like members of most other Afghan armed forces, whether the Afghan Army, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or independent militias, from the time they wake up until they go to sleep at the end of the day, the majority of the ASG are under the mild narcotic influence of hashish and or naswar, a sticky brown powder placed between the lip and the gum, concocted from tobacco, slacked lime, lavender, and opium. Far as I can tell, they're baked pretty much 24/7, confirms a young American specialist as he looks through a stack of counterfeit DVDs being offered for sale by a pair of local tribesmen just beyond the gate to the base. But they're good to have on your side. The ASG we go outside the wire with, most of them would lay down their life for you. Ain't that right, Snoop? Snoop, a skinny 27-year-old Pashtun who happens to be walking past with his AK-47 slung over his right shoulder, commands the ASG, garrison attached to Forward Operating Base Tillman. In lieu of a reply, he looks impassively at the specialist and says nothing, even though he understands English quite well. American soldiers at the base started calling the commander Snoop a couple of years previously because he bears an uncanny resemblance to the rapper Snoop Dogg. But his actual name is Abdul Ghani, and at the moment he is clearly less than pleased to be addressed as so informally by a lowly specialist, a rank just above private. After staring icily at the soldier for several seconds, Commander Ghani spots someone he apparently has been looking for and strides briskly away to speak with him. The specialist, oblivious to Ghani's scorns, continues perusing the bootleg DVDs. "Hey, check it out," he exclaims to nobody in particular. "Rocky Balboa, the new Stallone flick. I didn't think it's even in the theaters yet back in the States, but these Hajis already got it for sale here in East Bumfuck, Afghanistan." After walking away, Ghani approaches 3 Pashtuns who work as manual laborers at the base and without warning raises his rifle stock and strikes one of them in the side of the head. The man cries out and staggers but remains on his feet, which prompts Ghani to grab him by the shoulders and throw him to the muddy ground and begin cursing at him in Pashtu. When the tribesman stands up, Ghani knocks him down again and continues yelling at him. Then the commander turns and walks back toward the base, muttering in English, "I swear, I should go back there right now and really kick his ass." Noticing the shocked expression of the American journalist walking beside him, he bristles at the reproach implied by the reporter's reaction. "That guy, he has done some bad things against me. If someone is bad to me, I must be bad to them. You know why? Because if you didn't, that guy will think you are a pussy guy, and then he will be bothering you all the time. You have to go against him back, you know." When the journalist expresses skepticism, Ghani only becomes more adamant. "I am telling you, if the guy does something wrong and you didn't do something back against him after this, he will have no respect for you. He will think you are a pussy motherfucker, and then he will be bothering you. Every time he sees you, he will give you a hard time." Commander Ghani has just provided a vivid summation of the Pashtun principles of name, honor, gairat, pride, and badal, revenge, which along with the fourth concept, melmastia, hospitality, account for the most important tenets in an unwritten, overarching code of behavior known as Pashtunwali that has shaped culture and identity in the part of Central Asia for centuries. There are an estimated 15 million Pashtuns living in Afghanistan's southern and eastern provinces. They constitute the nation's largest ethnic group. Another 26 million Pashtuns live across the border in western Pakistan, and to a great degree, Pashtunwali dictates how these 41 million people conduct their lives. This is what Americans did not educate themselves about and have no idea of the country and the culture that they send our troops to. The tenets of Pashtunwali are fluid, highly nuanced, and occasionally contradictory. According to the precepts of Melmastia, a Pashtun is obligated to show hospitality to all visitors, especially strangers. Guests are to be fed, sheltered, and protected from harm. If they request it, even mortal enemies must be given sanctuary. According to the precept of Badal, any injustice, no matter how slight, must be avenged. If a man suffers even the relatively minor insult of a personal taunt, for example, the insulted party must shed the taunter's blood. If the taunter flees before justice can be carried out, the blood of the closest male relative must be shed in his stead. Endeavoring to uphold this structure, families sometimes engage in deadly feuds that have been known to drag on for decades. At their root, most aspects of Pashtunwali are about preserving honor and respect. And in the Pashtun society, respect ultimately derives from demonstrations of strength and courage. When Americans or Europeans hear accounts of entire families wiped out in the name of Badal, or one Pashtun beheading another to redress a seemingly inconsequential insult, the typical reaction is shock and revulsion. The tenets of Pashtunwali are hardly unique to Central Asia. However, in American cities, for instance, it is not uncommon for adolescents to be gunned down for showing disrespect to gang members. And if a Red Sox pitcher beans a Yankee batter, nobody is the least bit surprised when the Yankee pitcher hurls a fastball at the head of the Red Sox batter as a payback in the next inning. These are the cultural precepts that Americans are not aware of. And in fact, in Afghanistan, there is no Afghan tribe. There are the Pashtuns, there are the Hazara, there are the Uzbeks, and there are the Tajiks. There are four main ethnic groups that live within the borders of Afghanistan, which was created by the Europeans drawing borders around tribal areas. This is why the Kurds are in not only just in Syria, but the Kurds exist in Turkey, they exist in Iraq, they exist in Iran, and they exist in Syria. They're spread throughout 4 different countries, and they don't have a country of their own, which in effect makes them a stateless group of people. So Pat Tillman enlisted in the United States military, trained for the Rangers, went to Iraq, and then volunteered for and was sent to Afghanistan on his second tour with his brother Kevin. They walked into the war, just like a lot of Americans have walked into the war. Pat Tillman was a little bit different because he was a little older than most of us in Vietnam. He wasn't drafted because there is no effective draft in place, even though Selective Service has all 18-year-old males signing up for it. And we will talk about the draft, I think, at another show later on. We're going to be talking about what the draft means and what we should do with it. But Pat Tillman was famous, well-known athlete. And in fact, when he joined the military, there were people, Donald Rumsfeld says, we must keep an eye on this individual, because their intent was to use him as a propaganda piece. So Pat Tillman's now in Afghanistan in 2004. He went there in March or February of 2004. And on April 22nd, In 2004, he walked into an ambush, and this is what happened. 7 months later, as Pat sat behind the boulder above the wadi, wounded, shouting his name, waving his hands over his head to signal that he was an American soldier, it's impossible to know what was going through his mind. His attention, however, would almost certainly have been focused on the open Humvee driving along the gravel riverbed just 40 yards below, carrying 7 of his Ranger comrades, 2 or 3 of whom were shooting in his direction. If Tillman had a football, it would have been pretty easy for him to hit the vehicle with a tight spiral pass. Gazing down at his brothers in arms, he would have seen Alders, positioned on the far side of the Humvee, turn to face him and then point his weapon up the slope. Although Pat probably couldn't make out Alders' features in the twilight, he would have known who it was from Alders' compact stature and the fact that he was holding a saw. A saw is an automatic machine gun. Shortly after Alders brought his weapon to his shoulder, Pat would have seen a flash from the gun's stubby barrel. Concurrent with the muzzle flash, 3 .223 caliber bullets pierced the right side of his forehead just below the rim of his helmet, killing him instantly. Although the entrance wounds were deceptively small and clean, each was just 5/16 of an inch in diameter, and all 3 were grouped tightly together. When the high-velocity, copper-jacketed bullets collided with the frontal bone of Tillman's skull, they broke apart and began to tumble wildly with devastating effect. As they careened through his flesh and then exited his body, the bullet fragments obliterated much of his cranium, expelling his brain onto the ground. What remained of Tillman's head was mostly skin and fasciae and resembled a punctured balloon. Upon hearing the first burst from Alders' saw shred the air, Brian O'Neill threw himself face down on the ground and tried to press his body into the earth behind the boulder. As he lay there, slightly below and to the west of Tillman, O'Neill testified, "I remember hearing what I thought was running water. I thought that Pat had urinated on himself. I asked Pat if he had urinated on himself, but he did not answer. I looked at the rock next to me, and I remember seeing a stream of blood. I didn't believe what I was seeing. I then saw what appeared to be pieces of blood and tissue. I thought I had been shot at first. I then realized that I was fine. I sat up, took a knee, and looked at Pat. He looked like he was kind of sitting with his back was on the hill, and he was laying back. I remember that I started calling for help." Baker's Humvee rolled to a stop behind the parked vehicles of Serial 1 at 6:48 p.m., and the shooting ended a moment thereafter. From start to finish, the firefight had lasted 14 minutes. 14 minutes of friendly fire. According to Steve Elliott's testimony, I eventually heard "ceasefire." It seemed like it was coming from everywhere. The vehicle was stopped at that point, and I saw an AMF soldier who had come around to the back of the vehicle. The impression I got from him was that he was worked up and he wanted us to stop firing. I don't recall exactly if this AMF soldier was waving his arms and or calling out "ceasefire." He was pretty worked up. Most of the Rangers in both serials were deaf from the gunfire. According to Sergeant Mel Ward, one of Week's 2 team leaders who was up on the spur above Tillman's position, "When I could hear again, which took a little while because the .50 caliber makes a lot of noise, the first thing I noticed was someone screaming, 'Oh my fucking God, oh my fucking God.' I didn't know who it was, but because of the way he was screaming, I assumed he was wounded, probably in pieces. After telling his fire team to stay where they were and pull security in case they were still Taliban lurking, Ward hurried down to where the screaming was coming from. Ward arrived at the boulders about the same time as Staff Sergeant Weeks. O'Neill was in a state of hysteria. Weeks testified he was drenched with Tillman's blood and spattered with splinters of bone and chunks of brain matter. His helmet was off. His gun was lying on the ground. It was our guys that did it. They fucking killed him, O'Neill screamed at Weeks. We were waving our arms. How did they not know we were here? Weeks shouted at O'Neill to put his helmet on, pick up his weapon, and square himself away. After ordering O'Neill to pull security after a nearby sector to give him something to do, Weeks called Eric Godek, the platoon sergeant, and reported over the radio, I got one Eagle KIA, call sign Tango, indicating an American had been killed, and the last name started with the letter T. By this time, Sergeant Bradley Shepard, Weeks' other team leader, had also arrived at the scene. The first thing Ward did, says Shepard, after he sees Tillman, is pretty much decapitated. He falls on his knees and hugs him and starts crying. Ward, a taciturn, physically imposing, politically conservative ranger who was 2 years older than Tillman, does not believe men should cry in public, if at all, and is embarrassed that his peers saw him being a pussy. Only a couple of hours earlier, however, while the platoon had been cooling its heels in Magrath, Tillman and Ward had pulled security together off and on through much of the long afternoon, during which they had talked about their wives and families and what they intended to do when they got out of the Army. When Ward came upon Pat behind the boulder, he thought about his final conversation and was taken over by the events as they sat, as they say in the military. They gathered up Pat's body and had to put it in a body bag. But the other thing that happened was they picked up pieces of his brain and put it in an ammo box. And then somewhat later on, they burned all of his clothes. They burned everything they found inside the pockets. And they lost his brain in the ammo box. His brother Kevin was there in that same group of Rangers when Pat was killed, and accompanied his body back to the States. The end of this story is still not quite finished, because there's a lot of talk about what happened with Pat Tillman in Afghanistan, and because he expressly knew that they intended to use him as a propaganda piece, he told them he did not want a military funeral. And yet they had a huge medal awarding ceremony, and people there, and Donald Rumsfeld wrote letters, and they tried to convince his wife Marie to let him have a military funeral. But she said, according to Pat's wishes, he did not want a military ceremony, and he wanted to be cremated. So Pat Tillman knew that they had plans for him if he was killed. And his mother, Danny Tillman, and his family went after the military and actually called a congressional hearing to talk about what happened to their son and how they wanted to use him as a propaganda piece after he was killed by friendly fire. It was an incredible affair, all untold, and there is a beautiful documentary on YouTube called the Pat Tillman Documentary, which I would encourage all of you to watch. Pat Tillman was an exceptional young man who gave his life for the country and was killed by his own people in what's termed fratricide, which is brother killing brother, friendly fire. And these kind of incidents happen all the time in the military. They happened in Vietnam all the time. There were moments when we opened fire on people who didn't know who they were. They were civilians. They were our own people. Because you can't tell who's who at the fog of war. That's why it's called the fog of war. But what impressed me most about this whole thing was that the military wanted to use Pat Tillman, and his family refused to let that happen.